I came here to tell you what I saw, Marcus Bellamy said evenly. So why are you suddenly treating me like the man you're looking for? At 8:17 on a cool weekday morning in downtown Des Moines, Marcus, a 35-year-old Federal Bureau of Investigation special agent assigned to financial crimes cases, had been preparing to leave the building after a work-related meeting when a man pushed through a restricted service corridor and hurried across the lobby toward a side exit. A security employee called after him, then reached for the radio at his belt. Marcus stepped aside and watched the man disappear through the doors. He could have continued with his morning. Instead, when security asked whether he had seen which way the man went, Marcus stayed to give an account. That decision put him in the lobby when officers Grant Whitaker and Nolan Pierce arrived several minutes later. Whitaker, a tall white officer with a muscular build and short sandy brown hair, took the lead while Pierce began gathering basic information from security. Marcus explained what he had observed without embellishment. The man had emerged from the service corridor, crossed the lobby quickly, and exited toward the street. Whitaker asked why Marcus himself had been near the service corridor. I had business in the building, Marcus replied. He handed over his driver's license when requested. Whitaker looked at it, then back at Marcus. What kind of business? Marcus paused, not because he was frightened or confused, but because the question had shifted away from what he had witnessed. He wore a dark olive field jacket over a light blue button-down shirt, charcoal trousers, and brown leather shoes. Nothing about him suggested he had been running from anyone. Work, Marcus said. I was leaving when your guy came through. A white office employee carrying a laptop bag stepped from the same corridor behind them. Whitaker moved aside to let him pass, without asking where he had been or whether he belonged there. Marcus noticed. Pierce appeared to notice too, although he said nothing. Whitaker continued. Had Marcus entered any secured rooms? Did he know the man who ran? Why had he been standing so close to the corridor? Marcus answered each question directly, but the more he answered, the more Whitaker seemed to interpret his restraint as reluctance. Marcus had spent years interviewing people professionally, but for several seconds he still wondered whether he was reading too much into Whitaker's questions. Then the white employee walked through the same corridor without being stopped, and that uncertainty became harder to dismiss. Officer, Marcus said, keeping his voice measured. Security asked me to stay because I witnessed what happened. Am I a witness, or am I being detained? For the first time, Whitaker stopped asking questions. Pierce glanced toward his partner. The distinction Marcus had requested was simple, and it required a simple answer. Instead, Whitaker told Marcus to remain where he was. Marcus looked toward the security employee, then toward the doors through which the original man had disappeared. What specifically connects me to whatever you're investigating? He asked. Whitaker said they were still determining that. Then determine it, Marcus replied. But tell me what my status is. That was the moment the encounter changed. Whitaker's expression tightened, not dramatically, but enough for Marcus to recognize that his request for clarity had been taken as resistance rather than cooperation. Pierce shifted his weight and looked again at Whitaker, as if waiting for him to define what they were actually doing. Whitaker made the decision instead. He told Marcus he was being detained while they investigated the unauthorized access report. Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not step away. He simply looked at Whitaker and said, "Then I want the reason for that detention stated clearly." Whitaker ordered Marcus to turn around and place his hands behind his back. Marcus complied, realizing that in less than 10 minutes, he had gone from the person who stayed behind to help police find a suspect to the person police had decided to restrain. Marcus turned as instructed and kept his hands where Whitaker could see them. The restraint was applied without struggle, and the change in his status was unmistakable. Pierce still held Marcus's driver's license, and nothing from the identification check had produced a warrant, an alert, or any known connection to the man who had left the building. Marcus looked at Pierce rather than arguing with Whitaker. "There is a verification call you can make before you take this any further," he said. Whitaker asked what he meant. Marcus gave Pierce the name of his Federal Bureau of Investigation supervisory contact and told him the office could be reached through independently verified federal contact information rather than by trusting anything Marcus supplied. He did not demand special treatment or claim his job placed him beyond police questioning. "Verify it through your own channels. You do not have to take my word for any of it," Marcus said. "That should clear up part of what you were trying to determine." Pierce took out a small notebook and wrote down the information. We can verify it here, he said to Whitaker. The suggestion created a clear choice. The officers could spend a few minutes checking information Marcus had voluntarily provided, while continuing to investigate the original access complaint, or they could move him into custody first and ask questions later. Whitaker chose the second option. We will sort everything out at the station, he said. Marcus studied him for a moment. You have my identification. You have a verification contact. What evidence are you relying on to transport me? Whitaker answered that Marcus had been near a restricted area during an active investigation and that officers needed time to determine what had happened. Marcus did not debate the point further. Instead, he turned slightly toward Pierce. Write down the time I gave you that number. Pierce hesitated, then checked his watch and recorded it beside the contact information. Whitaker noticed, but said nothing. That small entry changed Marcus's approach. If the officers intended to make decisions before verifying readily available information, he wanted the sequence of those decisions preserved. Marcus was escorted outside and placed in the patrol vehicle without incident. During the short drive through downtown Des Moines, he did not try to convince Whitaker. Again, the important question was no longer whether Marcus could explain himself more clearly. He already had. The question was why a practical way to test his explanation had been available before transport and had not been used. At the municipal precinct, Marcus was taken through standard intake. His personal property was inventoried, his identification remained with the officers, and he was placed in a detention area while the access complaint was still being reviewed. Marcus answered necessary processing questions and otherwise remained quiet. He noted the wall clock, the names he had heard, and the order in which each decision had occurred. He had entered the morning as a witness who chose to stay and help. Now he was sitting behind a locked door while the verification information he had provided remained unused. Marcus understood something important then. Repeating his credentials would accomplish nothing. What mattered now was the record. He mentally reconstructed the sequence from the moment security asked him to remain in the lobby, when Whitaker arrived, when his driver's license was checked, when Pierce wrote down the federal contact, when Whitaker chose transport, and when intake began. Marcus could not control what Whitaker decided next, but he could make sure that if anyone later asked how this detention happened, the answer would begin with the decisions that had already been made. 43 minutes after Marcus entered the detention area, Nolan Pierce returned to the desk where he had recorded the verification information. The note was still there, including the time Marcus had specifically asked him to preserve. Pierce made the call. He identified himself, gave the reason for the inquiry, and followed the verification process through official channels rather than relying only on the number Marcus had provided. Within minutes, the answer was clear. Marcus Bellamy was exactly who he had said he was, a 35-year-old special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, assigned to financial crimes investigations, and his presence in the downtown building that morning was connected to legitimate work. Pierce carried the confirmation to Sergeant Linda Carver, the watch supervisor. Carver listened, then asked the question Pierce had been avoiding since the ride back to the precinct. When did he give you the information needed to verify this? Pierce checked his notebook. Before we transported him. Carver looked toward Whitaker. Whitaker did not dispute the timing. Instead, he made a narrower argument. Being a federal agent, he said, did not prevent Marcus from being questioned or detained if officers reasonably believed he might be connected to an offense. On that point, Marcus would have agreed with him. A federal badge did not place anyone above a legitimate investigation. Carver therefore did not treat the confirmation as the end of the matter. She had Marcus brought from the detention area to a nearby interview room, where she introduced herself and told him his employment had been verified. Marcus showed no satisfaction. Good, he said. Now we can stop discussing whether I told you the truth about my job. Carver asked what he wanted clarified. Marcus leaned forward slightly. What evidence connected me to the access violation at the moment Officer Whitaker decided to transport me? The room went quiet. That question separated two issues that had been blurred together from the beginning. Marcus's identity was now established. The justification for taking him into custody was not. Whitaker repeated that Marcus had been near the restricted corridor, had been questioned during an active investigation, and had appeared evasive about his business in the building. Marcus did not argue about tone or perception. Was any witness identifying me as the person who entered without authorization? He asked. No one answered yes. Did security tell you I was with the man who left? Again, no one said yes. Carver stopped the exchange before it became circular. She asked Pierce when he had first understood Marcus to be a suspect rather than a witness. Pierce started to answer, then paused. Whitaker said the suspicion developed during questioning. Carver asked for the specific observation or information that caused that change. Whitaker referred again to Marcus's proximity to the corridor and his responses. Carver wrote something down. Then she made a procedural decision that changed the direction of the morning. She instructed Whitaker and Pierce to prepare separate chronological accounts of the encounter, beginning with what they knew when they arrived and identifying the point at which each believed Marcus had become a legitimate investigative subject. Neither officer was to coordinate his account with the other. Marcus returned to the detention area while the reports were prepared. His federal identity was no longer an open question, and nobody challenged it again. About 20 minutes later, Carver placed the two preliminary chronologies beside each other. Pierce's account said Marcus had initially been treated as a witness, and that suspicion developed during Whitaker's questioning. Whitaker's account suggested Marcus's location near the service corridor had made him a potential subject almost immediately. Carver read both descriptions a second time. The officers agreed on where Marcus had been standing. They agreed on what identification he had provided. They even agreed on when Pierce had suggested verification. What they did not agree on was something more fundamental: when Marcus had stopped being a witness, and what fact had justified that change. Sergeant Linda Carver did not try to settle the conflicting accounts by asking either officer to explain himself again. Instead, she turned to evidence that existed before anyone at the precinct had begun defending a decision. The building security office had already responded to a routine request for surveillance footage connected to the access complaint, and the relevant clips arrived while Whitaker and Pierce were completing their chronologies. Carver reviewed them in sequence. The first camera showed Marcus Bellamy in the lobby before the reported incident, dressed in his dark olive field jacket and light blue button-down shirt, waiting near the elevators after finishing his business in the building. A later clip captured another man emerging quickly from the restricted service corridor and crossing the lobby toward the side exit. Marcus moved out of his path. He did not follow him, signal to him, or appear to know him. When the security employee approached Marcus moments later, Marcus remained in place and spoke with him rather than leaving. The next clip showed Whitaker and Pierce arriving. It confirmed something else Marcus had mentioned. During the officer's questioning, a white office employee carrying a laptop bag walked out of the same service corridor. Whitaker stepped aside and allowed him to continue without asking why he had been there. Carver watched that section twice. The footage alone could not establish what Whitaker believed or why he treated the two men differently, but it created a factual disparity that his report would have to explain. More importantly, nothing visible on the recordings showed Marcus behaving like the man security had originally reported. Carver called Whitaker into the review area and asked him to watch the relevant sequence. Whitaker remained composed. He said video could not capture everything an officer perceived during a live encounter and repeated that Marcus had seemed evasive when questioned about his reason for being near the corridor. Carver did not argue with him. "Show me where you documented that assessment before you decided to transport him," she said. Whitaker looked back at his preliminary chronology. His description of Marcus as evasive appeared there, but the document had been written after they returned to the precinct. Carver asked whether he had made any contemporaneous note, radio transmission, or other record identifying a specific behavior that connected Marcus to the access violation before the detention escalated. Whitaker said his judgment had developed during the conversation. That answer did not resolve the problem. It clarified it. Until that moment, Whitaker's interpretation of Marcus had largely controlled the encounter. Now the sequence could be compared against an independent record showing what Marcus had actually done. When Marcus was informed that security footage had been obtained, he did not ask to watch it or demand that Carver accept his interpretation. He made one request instead: "Please preserve the body camera recordings from the entire encounter, including the time." Before I was transported, Carver nodded. It was a reasonable request, and the footage was already subject to departmental evidence retention procedures because the detention was under review. Carver flagged both recordings for preservation. The next question would be answered by timestamps, not recollection. Carver returned to Whitaker's chronology, placed it beside the security timeline, and asked the question the review now depended on: What documented basis existed before custody, not afterward, for treating Marcus Bellamy as the person who needed to be detained? Nolan Pierce sat alone at a workstation with his body camera recording opened beside the chronology he had already started. By then, the question was no longer whether Marcus Bellamy had accurately identified himself. That had been settled. The security footage had also made it difficult to explain why Marcus had drawn greater suspicion than the other people moving through the building that morning. What Pierce needed to determine now was simpler and more uncomfortable. What had actually happened before Whitaker decided to transport Marcus? He moved through the recording carefully, listening to the sequence rather than relying on memory. Marcus gave his driver's license. No warrant or alert came back. Marcus offered a federal supervisory contact. Then Pierce heard his own voice suggesting that they verify the information at the building. The recording continued. Whitaker chose to take Marcus to the precinct first. A few seconds later came Marcus's request. Write down the time I gave you that number. Pierce stopped the video and looked at his notebook. The timestamp matched. There was no ambiguity about the order. Whitaker entered the work area while Pierce was still reviewing the footage. He did not ask Pierce to lie. Instead, he argued that officers routinely had to make decisions with incomplete information and that later review could make reasonable field judgments appear simpler than they had been. We did not have the whole picture, Whitaker said. Do not write this like we did. Pierce understood the point. Police officers could not be expected to know facts they had not yet discovered. But that was not what troubled him. The recording showed information they did possess, and an option they had consciously declined. Pierce looked at the chronology on his screen. He could describe the encounter broadly enough that the sequence became less important, or he could state precisely when Marcus provided the verification contact, when Pierce recommended checking it, and when Whitaker chose transport instead. One version would make the decision look like a product of general uncertainty. The other would preserve the actual order of events. Pierce chose the second. He wrote that Marcus had initially remained voluntarily as a witness, that no identification check had produced an alert connecting him to an offense, and that Pierce had recommended verification before transport. He recorded that Whitaker elected to continue with custody while the verification remained outstanding. Pierce did not accuse his partner of racism, invent a motive, or claim he had objected more strongly than he actually had. He also included his own failure to press the issue after Whitaker made the decision. When Sergeant Carver received the completed chronology, she compared it with the preserved timestamp and the body camera sequence. They aligned. Whitaker's account, however, continued to describe Marcus as an investigative subject from an earlier point in the encounter, even though it did not identify a new fact at that moment that established a connection to the access complaint. Carver called Whitaker back to the desk. Do not make any further changes to your supplemental narrative right now, she told him. The report and recordings are under supervisory review. Whitaker read Pierce's chronology, then looked across the room at his partner. Pierce did not look away. The two officers could no longer present the transport as a shared judgment made from the same understanding of events. It showed that one of those officers had recognized an available verification step before custody and had said so. Pierce had not stopped what happened to Marcus, and his report did not pretend otherwise. But when given the opportunity to reshape the morning into something easier to defend, he had chosen the record over his partner. For Whitaker, the problem was no longer Marcus Bellamy's explanation. The problem was that the documented sequence of events had begun speaking for itself. The factual question that had followed Marcus Bellamy from the office building to the precinct was finally answered when the building security team completed its access review. Electronic access records identified the person who had entered the restricted service area that morning, and security personnel matched that information with the man shown leaving through the lobby. He was not Marcus. The records also established that Marcus had no connection to the unauthorized entry, and nothing in the building's access history linked him to the person security had originally reported. Sergeant Linda Carver reviewed the information against the surveillance timeline before calling Whitaker and Pierce back to the desk. The person involved has been identified, she said. Bellamy is not connected to the access violation. This time, there was no unresolved identification issue and no competing interpretation that required another round of questioning. The original investigative reason for holding Marcus had ended. Carver ordered his release. His personal property was returned, and the detention process was closed without further restriction. Marcus checked the time as he gathered his belongings. Nearly 3 hours had passed since he had chosen to remain in the building lobby as a witness. He did not celebrate being cleared. The access records had answered a question that, from his perspective, should never have required hours of detention to resolve. Carver met him before he left and explained that the department would review the circumstances surrounding the detention separately from the original building complaint. Marcus listened, then asked whether the security footage, body camera recordings, officer chronologies, and verification timeline would remain preserved. Carver confirmed that they would. Whitaker stood several feet away. He no longer argued that Marcus's federal employment was uncertain, and he could no longer point to an unresolved access investigation as a reason to keep him in custody. Pierce remained quiet. His chronology was already part of the record, including the moment he had suggested verification before transport. Marcus looked at Carver. "I want to make one thing clear," he said. "I am not asking what happens because I work for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I am asking what would happen if I did not." Carver held his gaze for a moment before nodding. Marcus let the point stand. That distinction mattered. His federal position had helped confirm one piece of information quickly, but it had not created the problem. The problem existed earlier, when he had been transformed from a cooperative witness into a detainee without a clear factual link to the reported offense. Now the evidence had removed the final uncertainty about that point. Carver did not promise Marcus a particular outcome. She could not reasonably do that before a formal review. Instead, she told him the documentation would be forwarded through the department's supervisory process because the evidence raised questions about the basis for the detention and the differences between the officers' accounts. Marcus accepted that answer because it described a process rather than offering instant punishment. As he walked toward the precinct exit, the investigation into him was over. The next review would not be about where Marcus had been standing, what job he held, or whether he knew the man from the service corridor. Those questions had been answered. Carver gathered the preserved recordings, security timeline, access records, verification timestamp, and both officer chronologies into the incident file. For the first time that morning, Marcus Bellamy was no longer the person whose conduct required explanation. The documented decisions that had put him in detention did. By the time Marcus Bellamy walked out of the precinct, Sergeant Linda Carver had already elevated the detention for supervisory review. The decision did not require anyone to guess what had happened. The relevant record was now compact and unusually clear. Security footage showed Marcus remaining voluntarily as a witness. The access records identified someone else as the person involved. Pierce's notebook preserved the time Marcus provided a verification contact. Body camera footage captured Pierce recommending that verification before transport, and the officers' separate chronologies disagreed about when Marcus had supposedly become a legitimate investigative subject. Carver forwarded the material to the lieutenant responsible for the shift and contacted the department's internal review personnel because the issue had moved beyond whether the original detention had produced the wrong result. The question was whether the decisions leading to that result had been reasonable based on what the officers actually knew at the time. Whitaker was given an opportunity to explain his actions. He maintained that Marcus's proximity to the restricted corridor and his responses during questioning had created suspicion that developed quickly in the field. The lieutenant did not dismiss that explanation simply because Marcus had later been cleared. Officers sometimes made reasonable decisions that turned out to be wrong, but the review focused on the sequence preserved in the recordings. Marcus had remained after being asked to help. His identification produced no alert. No witness identified him as the unauthorized entrant. Pierce proposed a readily available verification step. Whitaker chose transport instead. The security footage then showed no observable connection between Marcus and the man who had left the restricted area. Taken together, those facts required more than a general statement about uncertainty. The review also required examination of Whitaker's existing personnel record. That record contained 2 prior documented complaints involving allegations of unsupported escalation during investigative encounters. Neither complaint was treated as proof of what happened to Marcus, and neither replaced the evidence from that morning. They mattered only because the current incident had independently reached the threshold for formal review, making Whitaker's prior documented conduct relevant to decisions about his duty status while the investigation proceeded. Shortly before the 3-hour mark from the original detention, the lieutenant made the immediate administrative decision. Whitaker was relieved of field duties pending formal investigation. His badge was not theatrically taken from him, and no one announced that he had been fired. He was simply informed that he would not return to patrol while the department examined whether his conduct violated policy. Pierce was also removed from active patrol pending review. His truthful chronology did not erase the fact that he had participated in the transport and had failed to press his concern when verification was available. The consequences were not identical, but neither officer left the morning in the professional position he had occupied when he entered that office building. For Whitaker, the reversal was especially stark. Hours earlier, his judgment had determined whether Marcus could leave. Now his own documented decisions had determined whether he could continue exercising patrol authority. Marcus did not witness that conversation. He was already gone, and the review did not need him standing in the room for dramatic effect. Later that day, Carver contacted him to explain that immediate administrative action had been taken and that a formal investigation would follow. She also asked Marcus to provide a complete statement about Pierce's role in the encounter. Marcus understood why the distinction mattered. Pierce had participated in a detention the evidence no longer supported, but he had also preserved the timestamp, recommended verification, and refused to reshape the chronology afterward. Marcus could make Pierce sound better than he had been, or worse. Instead, he decided there was only one useful thing he could give the investigation: exactly what happened. Marcus Bellamy gave his formal statement without trying to turn Nolan Pierce into either a hero or a villain. He described the encounter in the same sequence the recordings preserved. Pierce had participated in the detention. He had followed Whitaker's decision to transport Marcus even after recognizing that verification was available, and he had not challenged that decision strongly enough to prevent what followed. Marcus also stated what happened afterward. Pierce had written down the verification information and the time it was provided. He had recommended making the call before transport. Later, when the officers were required to document the encounter separately, Pierce had submitted an account that matched the recorded sequence rather than adjusting it to protect Whitaker. He should have spoken sooner, Marcus told the investigator. But when he finally had to choose between protecting the decision and telling the truth about it, he told the truth. Marcus asked for no particular punishment. The evidence, departmental policy, and disciplinary process would determine that. Over the following weeks, investigators compared the recordings, reports, security footage, and officer statements. The evidence supported misconduct findings against Whitaker, while his prior complaints became relevant only during the disciplinary phase. He remained off patrol and, when termination proceedings began, resigned rather than contest them. There was no public spectacle when he left. His career ended through paperwork, findings, and consequences attached to decisions that had once taken only minutes to make. Pierce received a suspension, mandatory retraining, and probationary monitoring. For the first time in his career, following a senior officer had become something he could no longer confuse with avoiding responsibility. The department's conclusion was neither that Pierce had done nothing wrong nor that one truthful report canceled everything before it. It was that accountability could distinguish between participating in a bad decision and later attempting to preserve that decision through an inaccurate record. Marcus accepted that distinction. He had never wanted his federal position to become a shortcut around normal accountability, and he did not want it used as a weapon to demand punishment beyond what the evidence supported. What mattered to him was that the process examined the officer's actions rather than his status. Months passed before Pierce completed the required conditions for returning to patrol. During that time, the department tightened its expectations around documenting why readily available verification was bypassed before a custodial transport when identity or authorized access was central to the officer's suspicion. The change was narrow, practical, and directly connected to what the review had exposed. When Pierce finally returned to duty, he did so without the certainty he had once borrowed from a more experienced partner. He carried something less comfortable, but more useful: the knowledge that remaining silent was also a decision. Marcus had said Pierce should have spoken sooner. The disciplinary process could not give him that moment back. His next encounter, however, could. Several months after Nolan Pierce returned to patrol under probationary monitoring, he encountered the first situation that tested whether the discipline had changed anything. It happened during an afternoon call at a downtown office complex. A black delivery driver had entered through a service entrance while carrying packages for a tenant whose suite information had recently changed. A senior officer at the scene questioned whether the driver was authorized to be there. Building staff could not immediately confirm the delivery, and the driver's electronic order showed a company name that did not match the directory near the entrance. The circumstances justified questions. They did not yet establish wrongdoing. Pierce listened as the driver explained that his dispatcher could confirm the delivery and that the receiving company had moved to another floor. When the senior officer began discussing taking him to the precinct until the situation could be sorted out, Pierce recognized the moment before it became something larger. Months earlier, he had recognized a verification option and allowed Whitaker's decision to override his concern. This time he spoke before anyone was transported. "We have a way to check this here," Pierce said. He contacted the dispatcher through independently confirmed company information while building security reached the tenant upstairs. Within minutes, both sources matched the driver's explanation. The company had moved, the directory had not been updated, and the delivery was legitimate. The driver collected his packages and continued upstairs. No dramatic apology followed. No crowd gathered. Nobody needed to discover that the man had an important relative, an impressive title, or a hidden position of authority. He was simply a delivery driver whose explanation could be tested before suspicion became custody. Because Pierce had spoken at the point when his judgment could still prevent a consequence, that was exactly what happened. The incident later appeared in the routine supervisory review connected to Pierce's probationary monitoring. Sergeant Linda Carver saw the report and recognized the difference immediately. She eventually mentioned it to Marcus Bellamy during a professional follow-up concerning the completed review of his own detention. Marcus was quiet for a moment after hearing what had happened. He did not call Pierce to congratulate him. He did not suggest that one correct decision erased the one that had cost Marcus nearly 3 hours of freedom. Accountability was not a transaction in which enough good behavior purchased the past back. But Marcus understood something had changed. Pierce had once waited until after the harm to tell the truth about what he had seen. This time, he had trusted evidence early enough to keep the harm from happening. That mattered more to Marcus than any dramatic expression of regret could have. His own federal position had made it easier for investigators to verify one part of his story, but the delivery driver had needed no such status. Fair procedure had worked for him simply because it was supposed to work for everyone. The morning Marcus spent in detention could never be returned to him, and the consequences for Whitaker and Pierce could not rewrite it. What followed, however, showed that accountability had become more than punishment. One officer had lost the authority he had repeatedly exercised without sufficient restraint. Another had faced suspension, retraining, monitoring, and the uncomfortable responsibility of changing how he acted when the next difficult moment arrived. And when that moment came, he spoke sooner. Closing reflection. Sometimes the most meaningful change is almost invisible from the outside. It may not arrive through a dramatic apology or a public declaration. It may appear in the few quiet minutes when someone chooses to verify before assuming, to question a decision before following it, or to speak while there is still time to prevent harm. Perhaps accountability has its deepest value when it does more than punish what happened yesterday and begins changing what someone does tomorrow. Marcus never needed his profession to make his dignity more valuable than anyone else's. The delivery driver at the end of this story quietly proves why that distinction matters. There are moments when fairness is tested most clearly not by how we treat people whose influence is obvious, but by how carefully we listen when there seems to be no powerful reason to listen at all. If you had been in Pierce's position, at what moment would you have spoken up, and what do you think would have made that decision difficult? What part of Marcus's response to everything that happened stayed with you most, and why?